of myself. My last sort of slightly longer little reflection on this nature. Pilgrimage. Lots of you have done pilgrimage. Some of you have done this particular pilgrimage, which is really cool. Pilgrimage is an experience that lots of people are drawn into. And if you haven't been, then just find the time. You don't have to fly to Europe and walk hundreds of kilometres. You can choose somewhere of significance and set out from here. We might do something in that nature as a community next year. There's a vague thought that we might have sort of a St Andrew's pilgrimage somewhere. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela is probably the best known and arguably the most popular Christian pilgrimage in the world. Interestingly, it represents what I think is a really interesting part of the breadth of the Christian cultural stream. All sorts of people undertake the pilgrimage, from those who, and there are some, I'm not one of them, but there are some who really, truly, devoutly believe that this is an act of devotion, and by performing this action, by doing this pilgrimage, they will sort of have a plenary indulgence, which means that they'll get time out of purgatory in the next stage of life. So there are some that really do that. They do that very earnestly. At the other end of the spectrum, there are atheists walking this trail alongside everyone else because they think, hey, it will be a great holiday, everyone else is going, I'll come too. It's all there. There are all sorts of people walking for all sorts of reasons. Now, the reason I put up this particular slide of this, now there are these road markers for, hundreds of kilometres, and you get one more or less every kilometre, and some places every 500 metres. I think it's a little bit intermittent depending on what province you're in, whether they've put all of the markers there. But you get these markers, and it becomes this thing. You count them off as you go along. Unsurprisingly, this is 100 kilometres to go. So there's some numbers, but there feels something momentous about 100 kilometres to go. But aside from it being significant around the number, there was actually something graffitied on this marker. Now you can't read it, but it's written here, down here. And what it says was, someone had written, "Only the pilgrims can understand how we feel right now, not the tourists." Now it was interesting because when Pip and I and Emily and Graham came across this mark and we took photos with it and we looked at it, but in the next several kilometres we talked quite a lot about it. In fact, we talked about it over the next several days, about what that was trying to express and what it might mean. Were we tourists or were we pilgrims? What was the difference? How did we feel about that statement? When I think about that graffiti in light of the Christian cultural stream, the conclusion I reach is those narrow definitions don't really matter at all. People will walk the pilgrimage for many different reasons, but by simply choosing to walk, they are immersing themselves in a wonderful and enriching part of the Christian tradition. The point is not that they are swimming in a different part of the river, or even swimming with a different stroke. What matters is that they're in the river. Walking the pilgrimage is about being in the river. This in theory, he says in theory, it stands above the bones that are claimed to be the relic of St James. You can probably guess in terms of how I just phrase that I don't really hold with that idea of those being the actual bones of the actual St James. My critical thinking just doesn't allow me to take that leap of faith, I'm afraid. I don't buy it. I know too much about the messy history of relics in Europe to go along with that particular idea, because certainly in medieval times there was a huge trade in relatives' bones getting hooked to this, that, or the other person being told that, oh, you know, this is the finger of Jesus, or this is, all sorts of ridiculous stuff. So it's possible, I accept that it's possible, but it's unlikely. And that's really why I'm telling you this particular story, because when I got there I had something that was a bit of a surprising religious experience, something that on this journey I wasn't expecting at all. One of the traditions of the pilgrimage is that on completion of your pilgrimage you go into the cathedral, you walk up some steps behind the statue, there's a little room behind it, and you can reach your arms around the shoulders of the statue and hug him. And the idea is that you share anything you want to share with the saint. So you can say whatever it is you need to say. On our last morning in Santiago de Compostela, Emily and Pip, her mum, dragged me out of bed to go and do this activity as sort of a rounding off of the pilgrimage. Having got there well before the sun came up, several hours before the doors actually opened, I certainly saw myself as tagging along with something that was sort of important to other people. That's where I was at. I was like, if they want to do it, I'll go along, might as well. Even if it was too early in the morning for me. Now, as we went in to hug the statue, I was thinking about, the thing that we had read in our guidebook about this tradition of telling the saint whatever you wish to share with them, whatever it is. So Emily goes up, Pip goes up, they hug the statue, and then it was my turn. Now, when I went up and put my arms around the statue, I found that my critical thinking and objectivity went straight out the window. Something deep within me came to the fore, and there I was, crying on the shoulder of an inanimate object. And I don't mean cry a little, I cried like I'd never cried. And when I stood back, I suddenly, that whatever had suddenly leapt forward it had gone. And actually suddenly I was completely together again. It was very funny. It was this just strange, strange experience. So what was that all about? When I first began, I do what I do, so I started trying to apply the rational critical thing. How on earth can I account for that thing that just happened? So I went to the things that I know, in my case, psychology. And I thought of a particular study. I thought, this might give me a bit of a handle on it. And it's sometimes called the Stanford Prison Experiment. I know it as the Zimbardo Prison Study. Some of you might have heard of that. It's one of really the great experiments of social psychology. And if you don't know much about it, here it is.
At the beginning of this study, the prisoners were arrested at their homes by real police officers and were taken off to the local police station. Now, this was not something which they had signed up for, and they were surprised, understandably, by this event, and they asked the police officers what was the relationship between this event and their signing up for a psychology study. And the police officers refused to be drawn into this conversation. So this was a very unsettling way of starting the study. Zimbardo brought them to a mock-up of a prison, which he created in the basement of the psychology department at Stanford University. What he did then was to divide his group into prisoners, into guards. The guards had a guard's uniform, and they had sunglasses, and they had a stick, and the prisoners wore loose-fitting smocks and sandals. Now, the prisoners spent 24 hours a day in this mock prison, and the guards came and went doing shifts.
Part of what he was doing was observing what was going to take place in this particular context and how those roles as either prisoner or guard, how they shaped or sort of changed the way people behaved.
The guards now fell into their job. Some of them liked it, some of them disliked it, but it was a job that they did. They gave commands, and now what happened is the prisoners followed them.
You can give me the blankets and sleep on the bed and mattress, or you can keep your blankets and 416 will stay in another day.
They found ways to punish prisoners if they misbehaved.
Let's see if we can count backwards here.
Let's try that out. 9,
8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, that's
bad.
Hey, I don't want anybody laughing.
It was certainly the case that initially the prisoners did show some signs of disbelief and rebellion about what was happening.
This is unbelievable. They took our clothes.
Hands off the door.
But after a fairly short while, they fell into their roles. They became very submissive and dependent, very powerless, and obviously showed signs of stress and anxiety and depression.
Things had gotten so bad that we no longer had a group of prisoners. What we had were individuals believing they were prisoners, struggling for individual survival, no longer caring about their other prisoners or their other fellow students.
Meanwhile, the guards got into their roles and the level of violence escalated over a period of days. They began to humiliate and degrade the prisoners and find every opportunity to exert their power and influence over the prisoners.
Some of them had prisoners clean out toilet bowls with their bare hands. They now taunt, humiliate, degrade the prisoners in front of each other, and they exert arbitrary control over the prisoners.
This escalation of aggression was so extreme that after a period of 6 days, the experiment had to be brought to a halt before the scheduled time.
I think he showed something that was important at the time, and I think it is about that notion that, because it's not about who you are internally that matters. It's about the social context in which you find yourself.
Zimbardo was wanting to move away from the idea that we can explain extreme behaviour by reference to individual personality characteristics, and wanting to move instead towards an explanation which focused on social structural factors as an explanation for behaviour.
It's about the groups to which you belong and how you take on those group identities and then, in a sense, become them. And I think that's what he showed, and I think that was such a radical way of looking at things at that particular time.